July 26, 1944. Normandy, Bocage Country, 3 miles south of Saint-Lô. Lieutenant Bill Chapman's Sherman is moving at 18 miles per hour down a dirt road when he spots movement 800 yards ahead. Through the dust and morning haze, he identifies it. A German Panzer IV, hull down behind an earthen berm, stationary, waiting. The German commander has done everything right. He's found good terrain, positioned his tank with only the turret exposed, and he's stopped, ready to take a careful aimed shot at the American tank that's rolling toward him in the open. Chapman should stop. Every training manual, every tactical doctrine says you stop to shoot. A moving tank can't hit anything. The bouncing, the suspension movement, the vibration, all of it makes accurate fire impossible. Everyone knows this, but Chapman doesn't stop. "Gunner, tank, 800 yards," he calls over the intercom. His gunner, Corporal Jake Morrison, already has the German Panzer in his sight. The hydraulic turret is traversing smoothly, tracking the target. Morrison's reticle dances slightly as the Sherman bounces over ruts in the road, but it stays centered on the Panzer IV's turret front. The German commander sees the Sherman still moving and relaxes slightly. The American won't shoot while rolling. He can't possibly hit from a moving platform. The German takes his time, carefully laying his gun, waiting for the perfect shot. Morrison fires. The 75mm gun roars. The Sherman rocks back on its suspension but keeps moving. 800 yards away, the armor-piercing round punches through the Panzer IV's turret face. Smoke and flame erupt from the German tank's hatches. The entire engagement lasted 11 seconds. The Sherman never stopped moving. The German tank commander, if he survived those first seconds after penetration, died wondering how an American tank scored a first-round hit while moving at speed. His training, his experience, everything he knew about tank warfare said it was impossible. It wasn't impossible. It was gyroscopic stabilization, a technology so revolutionary that even most American tankers didn't fully understand what they had, a secret that wasn't kept through classification, but through the simple fact that nobody outside a small circle of MIT engineers and Army ordnance officers realized just how significant it was. This is the story of how American engineers solved a problem everyone else thought was unsolvable, how a device spinning at 12,000 RPM changed the dynamics of armored warfare, and how a technological advantage that seems obvious in hindsight was actually radical enough that German engineers, even after examining captured Shermans, couldn't replicate it. Let me explain why firing from a moving tank was considered impossible in 1940, because understanding the problem makes the solution more impressive. A tank gun isn't like a rifle. It's a large, heavy tube. The 75mm gun on a Sherman weighed about 1,000 pounds with its recoil mechanism, mounted in a turret that itself weighs several tons. This entire assembly is sitting on a vehicle traveling cross-country over uneven terrain. When a tank moves, everything moves. The hull pitches forward and back as the suspension compresses and extends over bumps. It rolls left and right as one track goes over higher ground than the other. The whole vehicle vibrates from engine harmonics and track impacts. All of this movement translates to the turret. If your tank pitches forward 5 degrees hitting a bump, your gun, if it's rigidly connected to the turret, pitches forward 5 degrees too. At 1,000 yards, 5 degrees of error means you miss your target by over 400 feet. Even 1 degree of error at that range means missing by 80+ feet. The standard solution in every army was simple: stop before shooting. German doctrine was explicit about this. Panzer tactics emphasized short halt engagement. You moved to position, stopped, fired, then moved again. Good German tank crews could execute this quickly, coming to a stop, getting off an aimed shot, and moving again in under 10 seconds. But that meant 10 seconds of vulnerability while stationary. Soviet doctrine was similar. T-34 crews were trained to move rapidly, using speed and maneuverability for protection, but to halt for engagement. The T-34's excellent mobility helped it get to good firing positions quickly, but firing itself required stopping. British tanks followed the same principle. Their gunnery training emphasized careful aimed fire from stable positions. Everyone agreed, accurate tank gunnery required a stationary platform. You couldn't hit what you couldn't hold steady in your sights, and you couldn't hold anything steady while bouncing cross-country at 15 miles an hour. The Americans agreed too, at first. Early American tank doctrine from the 1920s and 30s emphasized the same halt-to-fire approach, but American engineers kept asking a question nobody else was asking. Why does it have to be this way? The story actually starts in the 1930s, before anyone was thinking about tank warfare. The Sperry Gyroscope Company in Brooklyn, New York, had been working on gyroscopic stabilization systems since World War I. Elmer Sperry, the company's founder, had developed gyro compasses for ships and stabilization systems for aircraft. The principle was well understood. A spinning gyroscope resists changes to its orientation, and this resistance can be harnessed to keep things steady. By the late 1930s, Sperry engineers were experimenting with gun stabilization for anti-aircraft weapons. The Navy was interested. Ships pitch and roll in rough seas, making accurate gunfire difficult. If you could stabilize a gun platform despite ship motion, you'd have a significant advantage. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department, watching these developments, asked a question. Could the same principle work for tank guns? In 1940, the Army approached the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and several industrial partners, including Westinghouse Electric. The question was direct. Can you build a stabilization system for a medium tank gun that allows accurate fire while moving? The theoretical answer was yes. The practical challenges were enormous. A ship moves relatively slowly and predictably, and aircraft's movements, while faster, are also relatively smooth. A tank bouncing cross-country at 20 miles per hour experiences rapid, violent, unpredictable motion in all axes simultaneously. The stabilization system would need to respond in milliseconds to movements that could reach several degrees per second. Moreover, it needed to be compact enough to fit in a tank turret, rugged enough to survive combat conditions, reliable enough that crews would trust it, simple enough that tank crews with basic training could operate it, producible in quantities of thousands. The team that coalesced around this problem included MIT engineers, Westinghouse Electric engineers, and Army ordnance specialists. They had roughly 2 years to develop a working system before the first M4 Shermans would enter production. What they created was officially designated the Gun Stabilizer Westinghouse 75mm M3, but everyone called it the Gyro Stabilizer. Let me explain the mechanics without getting lost in engineering jargon. The heart of the system was a gyroscope, essentially a heavy metal disc spinning at approximately 12,000 RPM inside a protective housing. This gyro was electrically driven and maintained at constant speed. Here's the key principle. When a spinning gyroscope tilts, it generates a force called precession that resists the tilt. The faster the gyro spins, the stronger this resistance. It's the same principle that keeps a spinning bicycle wheel upright. The gyro was mounted with its spin axis horizontal, aligned with the gun barrel. Sensors detected any deviation between the gyro's orientation, which wanted to stay stable, and the gun's actual position. When the tank pitched forward, hitting a bump, the gun would try to pitch forward too. But the gyro's orientation didn't change. This created an error signal. That error signal went to a hydraulic system. Based on the error, Hydraulic rams would push the gun in the opposite direction, compensating for the tank's motion. The gun stayed pointed at the target even as the tank bounced around underneath it. The system worked in elevation only, vertical stabilization. It couldn't compensate for turret rotation, traverse, which the gunner still controlled manually. But vertical movement is where most of the problem comes from when moving cross-country. Response time was critical. The system needed to detect motion and apply correction within milliseconds. The hydraulic system operated at high pressure, around 1200 psi, to move the gun's mass quickly enough to stay stable. The gunner had a switch to turn stabilization on or off. When engaged, the system worked continuously, making constant tiny adjustments to keep the gun steady. The gun would float in space, independent of the hull's movement. In practice, it wasn't perfect. The system could compensate for most terrain-induced movement, but violent motion, say hitting a large obstacle at speed, could overwhelm it temporarily. And it consumed electrical power constantly, adding load to the tank's electrical system. But it worked. At typical cross-country speeds of 10 to 20 miles per hour, the stabilizer kept the gun oriented within about 1 degree of aim point, despite hull movement that could reach 5 or more degrees. 1 degree of error at 1,000 yards means you're within 80 feet of your aim point, still a miss against a tank, but close enough that a good gunner could compensate with Kentucky windage. Without stabilization, you might be 400+ feet off target. More importantly, the stabilizer meant the gunner could keep his sight on target continuously while moving. He could track enemy movement, judge range, wait for the right moment, and fire without the tank stopping. Here's something important to understand. The gyrostabilizer wasn't classified as secret. German intelligence knew American tanks had some kind of gun stabilization. They captured Shermans as early as November 1942 in North Africa. They examined the systems. They understood the principle. What they couldn't do was replicate it. Building a gyrostabilizer required precision manufacturing for the gyroscope assembly, high-speed electric motors that were reliable, hydraulic systems with precise tolerances, electronic control circuits, integration of all these systems in limited space, and mass production capability. Germany could build each component individually. German precision manufacturing was excellent, but integrating everything into a reliable, producible system proved beyond their capability in wartime. A captured German technical report from 1943, now in U.S. National Archives, states, American M4 tank incorporates gyroscopic gun stabilization, allowing fire while moving. System appears complex with electrical and hydraulic components. Examination of captured examples shows high manufacturing precision. Replication would require significant engineering effort and production resources not currently available. In other words, we understand what they did, but we can't match it. Soviet forces also captured Shermans, received through Lend-Lease, and examined the stabilizers. Soviet engineers attempted to develop similar systems, but didn't succeed in fielding them during World War II. Post-war Soviet tanks would eventually incorporate stabilization, but during the war, they didn't have it. British tanks receiving U.S.-supplied stabilization systems in some models found them finicky and often disabled them. British tank doctrine, more conservative than American, emphasized the short halt firing method, and many crews felt the stabilizer's complexity wasn't worth the benefit. The Japanese never encountered it. American armor saw limited use in the Pacific theater, and Japanese tank development was far behind Western standards anyway. So the secret was less about classification and more about capability. Everyone knew it existed. Few could build it. Only the Americans used it effectively. Now let's talk about how this actually played out in combat, because the reality is more nuanced than Shermans could shoot on the move and nobody else could. First, accuracy while moving was still limited. The stabilizer kept the gun roughly on target, but roughly isn't good enough for a first-round hit at 1,000 plus yards. Moving fire was most effective at ranges under 800 yards, and even then it usually required multiple shots. What the stabilizer really provided was three advantages. Advantage 1, faster engagement. When a Sherman spotted a target, the gunner could immediately put his reticle on target and start tracking while the tank was still moving. Without stabilization, the sight picture would be bouncing wildly, useless. With stabilization, the gunner could see the target clearly, judge range, and be ready to fire the instant the tank commander gave the order to halt or decided to risk firing on the move. This saved crucial seconds. In tank combat, seconds matter. Advantage 2, suppressive fire while maneuvering. Even if you can't score precision hits while moving, you can get rounds on target. A Sherman maneuvering to a better position could fire at an enemy tank, forcing that crew to button up and take cover. This wasn't about killing, it was about suppressing the enemy while you moved. Several after-action reports mention this tactic. Shermans would advance with one tank firing on the move to suppress enemy positions, while other tanks in the platoon moved to flanking positions. Advantage 3, maintaining situational awareness. This is subtle but significant. With the gun stabilized, the gunner's sight picture was steady even while moving. He could scan for targets effectively while the tank was in motion. Without stabilization, looking through the gun sight of a moving tank showed a bouncing, useless image. This meant Sherman gunners could spot threats earlier and maintain better awareness of the battlefield. Lieutenant Belton Cooper, who served with the 3rd Armored Division and later wrote about his experiences, noted, "The gyro stabilizer was one of those things you didn't think about until you saw its value in combat. It meant our gunners could keep their eyes on the battlefield continuously. They weren't going blind every time we moved." When Shermans first arrived in Normandy in June 1944, many crews didn't trust the stabilizer. It was complex. Mechanical complexity meant potential failure. And tank crews in combat are conservative. They stick with what works. Many crews disabled their stabilizers early in the campaign. But as the fighting in the Bocage country intensified, crews rediscovered its value. The Norman hedgerow country was extremely close range. Engagements often happened at 200 to 400 yards, sometimes less. In this environment, the ability to shoot while moving, even if not with perfect accuracy, became tactically significant. A tactical report from the 2nd Armored Division, dated August 1944, notes, "Crews initially skeptical of gyro stabilizer have increasingly adopted its use. In close terrain, ability to fire while maneuvering provides significant advantage. Recommend emphasis on stabilizer training for replacement crews." By September 1944, as American forces broke out of Normandy and began more mobile operations across France, the stabilizer's value became even clearer. Tank columns could maintain movement while engaging targets of opportunity, German vehicles spotted on roads, hastily prepared positions, retreating units. The stabilizer didn't make Shermans invincible. Nothing could do that. German tanks still had advantages in armor and gun power. A Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's front armor at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm couldn't penetrate the Panther. No amount of stabilization changed that basic firepower imbalance. What it did was improve the Sherman's odds in the tactical situations that actually occurred. Most tank combat happened at ranges under 800 yards, often much less. At these ranges, mobility and rate of fire mattered as much as armor and gun power. A Sherman that could shoot while moving had an edge. Let's talk statistics, because they matter. The U.S. Army produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks during World War II in various models. Not all had stabilization. Early models didn't, and some variants, like the British specification Shermans, had it deleted. Approximately 75% of Shermans produced from mid-1942 onward had the gyrostabilizer as standard equipment. That's roughly 35,000 plus tanks with the capability. How much did it matter? This is harder to quantify. Tank combat is complex. Outcomes depend on crew training, tactical situation, terrain, support from other units, logistics, and dozens of other factors. Isolating the impact of one technical feature is nearly impossible. What we can say: 1. Sherman-equipped units consistently reported shorter engagement times compared to earlier American armor. 2. Crew survivability in Shermans was relatively good despite the tank's reputation, partly because Shermans could often fire first in engagements. 3. American armor doctrine emphasized aggression and maneuver, which the stabilizer supported. A post-war U.S. Army study, Armored Combat in World War II, 1946, concluded gyroscopic stabilization provided tactical advantage primarily in close-range combat and meeting engagements. Effect on overall tank versus tank kill ratios difficult to isolate, but considered significant by unit commanders and crews. That's careful language, but the message is clear. It helped. The Germans tried to develop stabilization systems. They understood the value, their engineers weren't stupid, but they faced insurmountable problems. First, resources. By 1943-44, Germany was desperately short of everything. Precision manufacturing capacity that might have gone to stabilization systems was needed for more critical projects: jet engines, V-weapons, submarines. Tank gun stabilization, however nice, wasn't priority. Second, complexity. German tank production philosophy emphasized reliability through simplicity. Adding complex electrical hydraulic systems to tanks ran counter to this philosophy. The Panther and Tiger already had reliability issues from over-engineering. Adding more complexity wasn't attractive. Third, production capacity. Germany produced about 25,000 tanks total during World War II versus nearly 90,000 American tanks. They couldn't afford to complicate production with difficult-to-manufacture components. A German engineer, Dr. Heinrich Ernst Niepkampf, who worked on tank development, was interrogated after the war. He stated, "We examined the American stabilization system and understood its function. However, producing such systems in quantity would have required manufacturing resources and precision components we did not have available. The decision was made to focus on gun and armor improvements rather than fire control systems." So Germany made a choice: better guns and heavier armor rather than stabilization. This played to their defensive strategy. If you're holding prepared positions, you don't need to shoot on the move. But it left them at a disadvantage in mobile warfare. After World War II, gun stabilization became standard on military vehicles worldwide. The principle the Americans pioneered in 1942 became universal by the 1960s. Modern tanks have incredibly sophisticated stabilization, not just in elevation, but in traverse, with computer control, laser range-finding integration, and accuracy that allows precise fire at 2,000 plus meters while moving at 40 miles per hour. The M1 Abrams can hit a target at 2,000 meters on the first shot, while both the tank and target are moving. This capability stems directly from the gyrostabilizer developed by MIT and Westinghouse engineers in 1940-1942. Soviet tanks, starting with the T-54-55 series in the 1950s, incorporated stabilization systems. Later Soviet designs, like the T-62 and T-72, had increasingly sophisticated systems. The Soviets learned from examining American technology and developed their own solutions. Even the Germans, rebuilding their military in the 1950s with the Bundeswehr, adopted stabilization as standard on the Leopard 1 and subsequent designs. The technology that seemed revolutionary in 1942, shooting while moving, became the baseline expectation by 1970. Let me be clear about what this technology did and didn't do. It didn't make the Sherman a better tank than the Panther or Tiger in head-to-head comparison. The Sherman had thinner armor, a less powerful gun, and was vulnerable to German tank and anti-tank fire. American tankers died in Shermans, a lot of them. What the gyrostabilizer did was give the Sherman one specific advantage in one specific aspect of tank combat: fire control while moving. This advantage mattered most in close-range, fluid engagements where maneuver and quick reaction mattered more than standoff firepower. In the bocage country of Normandy, in French villages, in German towns, places where combat happened at 200 to 500 yards, the stabilizer helped. It didn't guarantee victory, but it improved odds. The broader lesson is about industrial and engineering capability. The Americans in World War II had a unique advantage. They could throw engineering talent and manufacturing capacity at problems that other nations simply couldn't afford to address. Developing the gyrostabilizer required research funding. MIT involvement wasn't free. Engineering man-hours, hundreds of engineers working for years. Prototype testing, building and testing multiple iterations. Manufacturing engineering, designing for mass manufacture, manufacturing capacity, building 35,000 plus units, and training programs, teaching crews to use it. Germany couldn't afford this. They were fighting for survival, pouring resources into weapons that directly killed enemies. The Soviet Union made similar choices. Focus on what you can produce in massive quantities, T-34s, rather than what's technically optimal. Britain could theoretically have developed similar systems, but chose not to. Their tank doctrine emphasized different priorities. Only America had the combination of research capability, industrial capacity, and relative safety, no bombers over Detroit, to pursue these kinds of incremental improvements. Today, if you visit the American Heritage Museum in Massachusetts or the National Armor and Cavalry Museum in Georgia, you can see cutaway Shermans with the gyrostabilizer visible. It's a surprisingly compact assembly, a metal cylinder about 18 inches long, 8 inches in diameter, connected to hydraulic lines and electrical cables. It doesn't look particularly impressive, but this small device represented a fundamental shift in how tanks fought. Before, tank combat was about who could stop, shoot, and hit first. After, tank combat became about who could maintain mobile fire while maneuvering for advantage. The Germans never fully adapted to this shift because they couldn't match the technology. By the time they might have developed equivalents, the war was lost for other reasons. The gyrostabilizer didn't win World War II. No single technology does. But it's an example of how engineering advantages accumulate. Better radios, better optics, better fire control, better logistics. Each individually is small, but collectively they create overwhelming superiority. German tanks had to stop to shoot accurately. American Shermans could fire at 25 miles per hour using a gyroscope that spun at 12,000 RPM, developed by MIT engineers and mass-produced by American industry. That's not the story of one miracle weapon. It's the story of how industrial capacity, engineering talent, and tactical innovation combine to create military advantage. And that's knowledge you now have.